The dust of the high plains settled on everything Elara owned, which amounted to a threadbare dress and the hollow ache of obligation in her bones. For a year, she had been a ghost at the Thorn Ranch, her labor a silent penance for her father's debts, her presence tolerated so long as she remained invisible. But tonight, visibility was a punishment. Jedediah Thorn, a man whose soul was as barren as the land he lorded over, smiled a viper's smile, the firelight catching the cruelty in his eyes. His men, a pack of hyenas who fed on the scraps of his power, snickered behind him. The joke had been crafted with meticulous malice. She, the quiet, untouched girl they called the virgin cowgirl, was to be sent to the one man the town feared and reviled in equal measure, Silas, the blacksmith. A giant of a man, made strange by a deep silence and a body they deemed too chubby to be anything but monstrous. He lived in a crumbling homestead at the edge of decency, a place mothers used to frighten their children into obedience. The sentence was a night in his home. A night meant to break her spirit and cement Silas's status as a pariah. Thorn's voice was a greasy smear in the clean night air. "Go on, girl. Maybe he'll find a use for you." The laughter that followed was sharp and jagged. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird in a tiny cage. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. She could run, but to where? She could fight, but she would be overpowered. So she found a third option, buried deep beneath the shame and the fear. She looked not at Thorn, but through him, her gaze fixed on the distant, mocking horizon. She pulled the dignity she had left around her like a shawl and lifted her chin. A hush fell as the men waited for her tears, for her pleading. Instead, her voice, though it trembled, was clear and cold as well water. Let them watch. The words hung in the air, not an acceptance of their game, but a complete rejection of it. She turned her back on Thorn's stunned face and began the long walk down the dirt track toward the silhouette of the outcast's farm, each step a declaration of a war they had started, but she intended to finish. The path to Silas's homestead was a journey from one form of desolation to another. The Thorn Ranch was a place of sterile cruelty, its fences sharp and its ground trampled by uncaring hooves. This place was different. It was a testament to slow surrender. The fence posts listed like weary soldiers, and the gate hung from a single, rusted hinge. Wild weeds, tenacious and defiant, choked what was once a garden. Yet, as Elara drew closer, her observant eyes, honed by a life of watching from the periphery, caught details the jeering townsfolk would never see. A section of the sagging fence was mended with a knot of impossible complexity and strength. The broken handle of a well pump had been replaced by a piece of wood so smoothly sanded it glowed like bone in the pale moonlight. She pushed open the groaning door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of cold ashes, dust, and something else, the clean, metallic tang of the forge. A fire, low and banked, offered the only light, casting long, dancing shadows that made the single room seem cavernous. And there he was. Silas. He was larger than she had imagined, a mountain of a man hunched over a workbench in the corner. When he turned, his shadow consumed half the room. But his face, bearded and broad, held no malice. His eyes, small and dark, darted to her and then away, landing on the floorboards as if they were the only safe place to look. He was a creature of shame. Huddled on a small stool near the hearth was a child, a girl of no more than 6, with wide, terrified eyes and a thatch of tangled hair. She clutched a half-finished wooden horse to her chest like a shield. The scene was not one of menace, but of profound, aching loneliness. Silas gestured with a large, soot-stained hand toward a simple cot in the far corner, a threadbare but clean blanket folded neatly upon it. He did not speak. He did not have to. His silence was a story of 1,000 insults endured, a retreat so deep into himself that the way out had been lost. Elara, who had walked here expecting a monster, found only 2 broken people hiding in the dark. That first night, Elara did not sleep. She lay on the cot, every muscle coiled with a tension that had nothing to do with the man across the room. Her fear was for the world she had just left behind, the world that saw sport in this degradation. Through the thin walls, she could almost hear the phantom echoes of Thorn's laughter. The silence within the cabin, however, was a different entity altogether. It was not empty, but filled with the rhythmic sounds of a life pared down to its essentials. the soft sigh of the bellows as Silas tended the fire. The whisper of a knife against wood. The steady, hypnotic clang of a hammer on steel from the attached smithy, a sound that should have been jarring but instead felt like a slow, steady heartbeat. She watched him from beneath her lashes. He ate a meager stew, then set a bowl of it on the edge of the hearth for her. The gesture was so devoid of expectation, so matter-of-fact, that it felt less like an offering and more like a simple acknowledgement of her presence. A rock is here. A tree is there. A woman is on the cot. He then returned to his stool by the fire and picked up a block of pine. His hands, which could hammer raw steel into submission, moved with the grace of a musician, the knife peeling away delicate curls of wood to reveal the shape hidden within. It was a wolf, its head tilted as if listening to a secret sound. When it was done, he placed it gently beside the sleeping child, Lena, whose small fingers immediately found it and curled around it in her sleep. Elara felt something inside her shift, a loosening of a knot she hadn't known was there. She rose quietly and went to the hearth. The stew was simple, made of foraged roots and a little salt, but it was warm. As she ate, she understood. The cruelty wasn't here in this dusty cabin. The monster wasn't this silent, hulking man. The monster was the man who had sent her here, and the world that had let him. This was not a punishment. This was a sanctuary. When the sun's first pale fingers crept through the grimy window panes, Elara was already awake. She expected to be told to leave, to trudge back to the Thorn Ranch to face a new day of humiliation. Instead, Silas was already at his forge, the rhythmic pulse of his work an established part of the morning. He did not look at her. He did not acknowledge her. He simply worked. Later, as she knew they would, Thorn and two of his men rode by, their horses kicking up dust just shy of the property line. Their voices were loud, filled with lewd questions and jeering laughter. "Still alive in there, cowgirl?" Thorn shouted. "Or has the beast had his fill?" Elara's first instinct was to hide, to shrink back into the shadows of the cabin. But the stew she had eaten, the sight of the carefully carved wolf, had kindled something within her. It was a tiny spark of defiance in the vast emptiness of her despair. She walked out of the cabin, past the splintered porch railing, and into the overgrown yard, turning her back to them completely. She knelt in the patch of earth that might have once been a garden and began to pull weeds. Her hands, unaccustomed to the sharp thorns and tough roots, were quickly scratched and raw. But each weed she ripped from the earth was a silent answer to Thorn's taunts. Each patch of cleared soil was a reclamation. She would not be broken. She would build. She would grow something here. From the corner of her eye, she saw Silas pause in his work, his hammer silent. He watched her for a long moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze, confusion, perhaps, or a nascent curiosity. Little Lena peeked out from behind the cabin door, her large eyes following Elara's every move. Elara ignored them all, focusing only on the soil, on the satisfying tier of roots, on the small act of imposing order on chaos. She was no longer a victim waiting for her fate. She was a woman with her hands in the dirt, planting the seeds of a future no one could have predicted. Days bled into a week, and a silent language began to form between the cabin's 3 inhabitants. It was a language spoken not with words, but with actions, a vocabulary of mutual effort. Elara's garden, cleared and tilled with a rusty hoe she'd found, began to show the faint green promise of seedlings. She swept the cabin's floor, washed the single window until it let in a clean rectangle of light, and organized the sparse shelves. Her presence softened the hard edges of the place, breathing a quiet life back into its neglected corners. In return, Silas spoke through his craft. One morning, she found the hose handle had been replaced with a new one of smooth, balanced ash. The leaky bucket she used to draw water from the well was patched with a disc of shining tin, the seal perfect and watertight. He never presented these things to her, they simply appeared, discovered in the course of her daily chores. They were his form of conversation, acknowledgments of her labor. He began leaving small, whimsical carvings on the windowsill for her, a perfectly rendered oak leaf, a curled-up fox, a bird with its wings outstretched for flight. They were gifts of immense value, for they were pieces of his guarded heart. One evening, exhausted, she found a tear in the sleeve of her worn dress had been mended. The stitches were large and a little clumsy, the work of hands used to shaping iron, but the repair was strong, meant to last. A wave of emotion so profound it stole her breath washed over her. It was the tenderest gesture she had ever received. While Silas was her silent partner in work, Lena was her silent audience. Ilara began to talk to the child, a soft, running monologue about the shapes of the clouds, the names of the wildflowers she transplanted to the garden's edge, the stories her own grandmother had told her. She expected no reply, and received none. But the space between them shrank. Lena would now sit on the porch steps while Ilara worked, the small wooden wolf always in her hand, her gaze a little less frightened, a little more curious. They were 3 solitary islands, slowly, patiently, becoming an archipelago. The sky had been a bruised purple all afternoon, the air heavy and expectant. The storm broke just after dusk, not with a gentle rain, but with a sudden, violent assault. Wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls, and rain came down in sheets, drumming against the roof like a furious fist. Soon, the drumming was joined by a more insidious sound, the steady drip, drip, drip of water. 1 leak became 3, then a dozen. The roof, a patchwork of old shingles and hope, was failing. A stream of water poured directly onto their meager sacks of flour and cornmeal. Another leak threatened the cot where Lena slept, huddled and terrified. Panic seized Ilara. She grabbed the newly mended bucket and an old pot, frantically placing them under the worst of the streams, but it was a losing battle. The floor was becoming a muddy puddle. Just as despair began to set in, a huge shadow fell over her. Silas was there, his face grim in the flickering firelight. He didn't speak, but his movements were clear and decisive. He pointed to the largest bucket, then to the worst leak near the hearth. He gestured for her to move the supplies, his large hands orchestrating their defense against the deluge. Then, he did something that made her heart stop. He unbolted the heavy cabin door and walked out into the heart of the storm. Ilara watched, horrified, as he threw a heavy rope over the roof beam and, with astonishing strength and agility, hauled himself onto the slippery, treacherous shingles. He was a silhouette against the lightning-streaked sky, a titan battling the elements. He crawled to the gaping hole above the hearth and covered it with his own body, shielding it from the downpour while he used his hammer to nail a loose sheet of tin into place. The sound of his hammering was a defiant roar against the wind. When he finally climbed down, he was soaked to the bone, shivering, his hair plastered to his face. But the main leak had stopped. As he stumbled back inside, their eyes met across the sputtering fire. For the first time, there was no shame in his gaze, only exhaustion and a shared sense of victory. Ilara wordlessly took the driest blanket from her own cot and wrapped it around his massive shoulders. It was no longer an act of coexistence. It was an act of care. The storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. But it had changed more than just the landscape. The sight of Silas on the roof, a lone guardian against the tempest, had not gone unnoticed. A few of the townspeople, woken by the ferocity of the gale, had seen it too. A new story began to circulate in the town, whispered over breakfast tables and store counters. It wasn't a story of a monster and his captive, but of a man protecting his home. The narrative began to pivot. People passing by the small homestead now saw it differently. They saw the neat rows of Ilara's garden, vibrant with life. They saw the mended fence, the clean window, the solid patch on the roof. They saw Ilara, not as a shamed, broken girl, but as a figure of quiet industry and strength. They saw Silas, not as a lumbering outcast, but as a diligent craftsman and a protector. The scorn that had once coated their name like dust began to be replaced by a grudging respect. The shift was subtle at first, manifesting in small, anonymous gestures. One morning, a warm loaf of sourdough bread from the baker's wife appeared on the fence post. A few days later, the town doctor, making his rounds, paused his buggy and left a small glass jar of horehound candies on the porch rail, nodding once toward the window where he'd seen Lena's small face peeking out. These were peace offerings, tentative bridges being built across a chasm of prejudice. Ilara accepted them with a quiet, grateful heart. She and Silas were no longer an island, the mainland was slowly drifting toward them. But this change did not go unnoticed by Jedediah Thorne. His power was rooted in the town's fear and derision of Silas. The community's budding respect was a direct threat to his authority. The sight of the flourishing farmstead, a symbol of resilience where he had intended ruin, was a personal affront. His cruelty, having failed to break them, now began to curdle into a dangerous, focused rage. The confrontation came on a bright, clear morning, the kind of day that felt full of promise. The air of peace was shattered by the thunder of hooves. Jedediah Thorne arrived, not with the two cronies from before, but with four grim-faced men, all of them armed. They reined in their horses, forming a semicircle before the cabin, a clear and deliberate act of intimidation. Thorne's face was a mask of smug fury. He held a rolled-up document in his hand like a scepter. "The joke is over," he announced, his voice carrying in the still air. He claimed Ilara had violated the terms of her father's indenture by absconding to live with a vagrant, a lie so blatant it was breathtaking. He then unrolled the document, declaring it a writ of forfeiture on Silas's land, citing a fabricated debt to the Thorne estate that had supposedly been left by Silas's father. It was a complete fiction, a land grab disguised in the thinnest veil of legality. He was here to evict them, to tear down the life they had so painstakingly built from the dust. Silas appeared in the doorway, filling it completely. He stood as he always stood, a silent, immovable mountain. But this time was different. This time, he was not alone. Ilara moved to stand beside him, not behind him. She was smaller, more fragile, but her presence squared his shoulders and sharpened his silhouette. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce, protective fire. For Silas. For Lena. For this home. She looked directly at Thorne, her gaze unwavering. And for the first time since that first, defiant night, she spoke to him directly, her voice not loud, but imbued with a clarity and strength that cut through his bluster. "This is our home," she said, each word a stone laid in a foundation of defiance. "You have no right here," Thorne sneered, dismounting from his horse. "Rights are for those who can afford them. Now get out of my way." As Thorne took a step forward, his hand reaching out to shove Ilara aside, a new sound joined the tense standoff. It was the crunch of boots on the dirt road. From behind the thorny brush of the lane, the town's blacksmith emerged, a heavy hammer held loosely in his hand. He was followed by the baker, his arms dusted with flour, and then the doctor, his black bag in his hand. More figures appeared behind them, farmers, the general store owner, their wives. A dozen people, then 24, a silent, unbeckoned militia of conscience. They didn't draw weapons or shout threats. They simply stood there, a few yards behind Ilara and Silas, their collective presence a formidable, unbreachable wall. They were the conscientious community, no longer passive witnesses but active participants. "That writ, Thorne," the town blacksmith called out, his voice a low growl. "Let's see the judge's signature on it." "Seems to me a claim that old would need a proper court seal," Thorne, a bully whose power depended on the isolation of his victims, faltered. He was prepared for a fight with a silent giant and a broken girl, not a public legal debate. He sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "This is my business. It has nothing to do with any of you." "It became our business," the doctor said calmly, "when you decided to use cruelty as a spectacle. We've seen what's been built here. And we won't see it torn down on a lie." In that moment of high tension, as Thorne's authority crumbled under the weight of 100 watchful eyes, a new, tiny voice pierced the air. Lena, who had been hiding behind Ilara's skirt, her small hand clutching the fabric, took a tentative step forward. She held up the wooden wolf Silas had carved for her, a totem of her father's silent love. Her wide, serious eyes scanned the faces of the crowd, of Thorne, of her protectors. Then, looking at the cabin behind her, she spoke her first word to the world, a word that was both a question and a final, irrefutable declaration. "Home." The sound, so pure and clear from the silent child, was devastating. It shattered the last vestiges of Thorne's bluster, exposing his greed for the ugly, pathetic thing it was. Humiliation washed over him, more potent than any physical threat. Without another word, he snatched his horse's reins and mounted, riding away with his men, their retreat a cloud of ignominious dust. In the quiet aftermath, the air hummed with a new kind of energy. The crowd of townspeople did not disperse. Instead, they began to move forward, not with intrusion, but with purpose. The blacksmith walked up to the dilapidated forge, inspecting the bellows. The baker's wife approached Ilara, pressing a basket lined with a clean cloth into her hands. Inside were eggs, a slab of bacon, and a jar of milk. It was a beginning. The days that followed were a blur of communal effort and gentle reconstruction. Men from the town, guided by Silas's quiet expertise, tore down the rotten sections of the roof and laid new, sturdy shingles. Women helped Ilara plant a larger garden, bringing seeds and saplings from their own plots. The most significant project was the hearth. The old stone fireplace, the heart of the home, had long been crumbling. Together, the men dismantled it, stone by stone, and rebuilt it, larger and more solid than before. As Silas set the final, heavy keystone in place, it was more than a repair, it was a consecration. A new heart for a new family. One evening, as the three of them sat before a brightly burning fire in the new hearth, the warmth reaching every corner of the cabin, Silas turned to Ilara. The firelight played across the rugged planes of his face, softening them. He looked at her, his gaze direct and full of a profound, unspoken history. Then he spoke, his voice rough and deep from long disuse, but gentle as the touch of his hand on wood. "Thank you," he said. It was only 2 words, but they contained a universe of gratitude. For seeing him. For staying. For building a life where he thought none was possible. Ilara simply reached out and took his large, calloused hand in her own. Her touch was his answer. Theirs was not a love born of grand passion, but one forged in the quiet crucible of shared hardship, mutual respect, and unspoken understanding. It was stronger than steel, more enduring than stone. They sat there, with Lena sleeping peacefully between them, a family born not of blood, but of a cruel joke that had blossomed, against all odds, into a profound and beautiful truth. Thank you for watching this story unfold with us. The journey from despair to hope is a powerful one, and it's a testament to the strength of the human spirit to find family in the most unexpected places. If this story of resilience, community, and quiet love moved you, please consider showing your support. You can do this by hitting the like button, which helps our stories reach more people who might need to hear them. Subscribe to our channel to be the first to see our new inspirational films. And we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Ilara and Silas's story resonated with you the most? Your engagement helps our community grow, and we are so grateful to have you as a part of it. Until next time, may you find strength in kindness and build a home wherever you find love.